We are examining two texts of Scripture and trying to parallel them and see if we can't grab an understanding of how they work, maybe in some ways independently, and then how they work together as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 34, and also in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 11 and 12, there's this conversation that we started on Sunday in regards to let the women keep silence in the churches or in the assemblies. And there's lots of words we've got to define and lots of things we have to kind of understand, I think, before we can start defining or drawing any kind of conclusions from these particular narratives. We have, if you have this lesson 4 question sheet that I gave out, we pretty much did that Sunday. We use this to kind of help us define the terms. Now I want to dig a little deeper in a couple thoughts, and then we want to try to see if we can make sense out of it all. Now that we've kind of had the time to digest a little bit of the definitions, if you will, and some of the particulars in relationship to these texts, and now see whether or not we can't find an answer to what these mean. And so we noted in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, what's the context of study from chapter 11, 12, 13, and 14? Spiritual gifts, right? They've had division is a core issue they've got there at Corinth. That's correct too. But the context of discussion in these chapters has been spiritual gifts. And in particular in chapter 14, what's the discussion as it relates to spiritual gifts? Tongues. Those are the specifics, but how do we deal with it in what moment? Yeah, in the assembly, right? When we've come together to worship, and one's got a tongue, and another's got a prophecy, and another one's got a psalm or a hymn to sing, and another one wants to say this, and another one wants to say that. How do you handle that? And Paul goes through a lengthy process, really. He doesn't just govern women, by the way, does he? Who else does Paul govern in this text? Yeah, all of them, right? He tells the tongue speakers, if there's no interpreter, what? You be silent too. That's man or woman. If there's no one there to interpret what you're saying, then you be silent. Same word as well. If you're trying to determine how many should give a prophecy, he said by what? 2 or 3, right? And he said once one speaks, then let what? Another one judge or validate what had just been said. And ultimately, the final thought within the context is what basic principle? Let all things be done with decency and order, right? Paul is governing a challenging circumstance at Corinth, where all I can conclude is their worship assemblies had become chaotic and disorderly. And that problem occurred because everybody who had a spiritual gift never wanted to sit back and let anybody else take care of things that needed to be taken care of. Everybody wants to be jumping in there, and they had chaotic problems. In fact, he also talked about the fact that if somebody from the outside would come in, what would they see? Confusion, right? And God is not the author of confusion. So don't define what's happening in verses 34 and in 35 without considering what's actually under conversation within the entire narrative. Because verses 34 and 35 are very specific. Let your women keep silence in the churches or in the assemblies, depending on which translation you're reading from. For it is not permitted. I'll put this back up on the screen for you. For it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. If they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Or again, some translations use the word in the assembly, which I believe is probably the correct or a fair understanding of the conversation here. And so she is restricted in specific to spiritual gifts. Now, why would it be important to have that conversation in relationship to how women need to conduct themselves within the assembly? Let me re-ask that. Are men the only ones who have spiritual gifts? No. Plenty of evidence within Scripture to note that there were women who had spiritual gifts too. So how do we deal with that problem, Paul? how do we deal with the issue of the fact that we have both men and women who have spiritual gifts? And when we've come to the assembly, how are we supposed to navigate that circumstance? Because she's no more or less spiritually gifted than this man is. And so Paul takes them back to some very base principles of how things should be governed in relationship to the assembly, in respect to the authority and the order of things that God has created. You could go into the book of Ephesians and see that as well, right? Where God says that Christ is the head of man, man's the head of woman, and God is over all, right? That order, right? That's the conversation, the order of things. Then you add what Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and verses 11 and 12, and you can begin to appreciate kind of two texts that share a theme, although they are different, by the way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we are dealing with something very specific, right? There is no shadow of a doubt that he's talking about conduct during the assemblies, when the church is gathered together. Can we make that clear of a statement as it relates to 1 Timothy chapter 2? Nobody wanted to take a stab at that, right?
I don't know how you mean it, but the women, the men were prophesying, and the prophesying was teaching at that time, of course, as they were guided by the Holy Spirit. While they were doing that, the woman was not permitted to speak. If she wanted to know anything, she could ask her husband at home. That's different from over here, where women have the right to ask questions, but in the spirit of humility and in subjection to man, not to override the authority of man.
Right. So they are not exact verbatim circumstances or issues. You're addressing two different circumstances. In fact, there's no specific mention of the assembly in 1 Timothy chapter 2. There's a spiritual conversation going on because he addresses at the beginning of the outset by saying we should do what? What's the item of worship, if you will, that he begins to specifically talk about? Prayer, right? And so there's a spiritual context to 1 Timothy chapter 2, but not in its entirety, and not for the same reasonings that 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is stated. And here's why I want us to think that through a little bit. Because if we argue that 1 Timothy 2 is completely and solely about the assembly, what do you do with verse 9? Does that mean that her adornment and modest apparel and shamefacedness and sobriety is solely in the assembly? If we argue that 1 Timothy 2 is all about the assembly, then it's all about the assembly. We can't pick and choose what we want to apply to the assembly and what we want to apply to other things. We have to be careful that we don't overstate. Is that a spiritual context? Sure it is. Does it have meaning as it relates to when people are praying and engaged in spiritual activity? Sure it does. But be careful that we don't just blanketly say he's dealing with the assembly in 1 Timothy 2 from its start to finish, because I don't believe I can make that argument, because he doesn't specifically say it, and there are too many other things within the narrative that aren't necessarily solely relating to the assembly. Go ahead.
Is this actually just strictly a personal thing?
Well, I mean, no, and I don't want to imply that it has no context of the assembly. I'm just saying it is both personal and the conduct that is appropriate in spiritual settings, because he's talking about prayer at the outset of the text. He's talking about spiritual conduct that's going on, what men are doing and what women are doing in that spiritual context. And so they are different, though they have parallels. They are different.
He has some personal things in there.
That's right.
It tells them what to do.
Yes, it certainly deals in that regard. The difference really is, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, she is told to be what? Silent, right? And the word used in 1 Corinthians 14 is that, silent. Okay, it's the stronger of two. Let me finish, Tom. I'll come right back to you. This word in 1 Timothy 2 verse 11 is a different Greek word, which means in quietness, with humility. It's a different picture in 1 Timothy chapter 2 in comparison to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. I laid all this groundwork down Sunday, and I'm just trying to make sure we etch it back into our minds before I make some applications.
I don't understand. It says, ask your husband at home. If a woman's not married, she doesn't have a who she goes to.
Okay, let me come back to that, because I'm not to the application part yet. Let me get there. Okay, I will come back to it though.
All right.
Are you going to let me finish the definitions first? Don't ask me any questions. Okay, no questions until I get all the definitions done, and then I'll field them all we can in the time we've got. Okay, and Roger can answer. But because we need to add this part, because "but I suffer" means in connection to what I just said. But I suffer not a woman to teach. By the way, teach is didaskos, which is, by the way, formal. When he says teach, he doesn't mean teach a child to tie your shoes. He doesn't mean instruct somebody on how to get from here to New Martinsville. He's talking about didaskos. He's talking about formal. I suffer not the woman to teach in a formal capacity, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence or quietness. So the command here, if you will, for women professing godliness, she needs to learn in quietness, remembering her subjective relationship to man, and she cannot take on the formal role of teaching over that man in a spiritual context, and nor can she usurp authority over a man in the context of the spiritual conversation that's happening in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, when it came to spiritual gifts and using them in the assembly, silence, nothing. When it comes to let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, this is about formally teaching over a man in a spiritual context of gathering and usurping authority over him. Not permitted to be in silence, quietness, as it relates to that. That's why when we have our worship assemblies, the public roles are done by men, because otherwise she would have to usurp over him in order to do that. If she filled a formal role of some kind, she would have to usurp the authority of man to do that. Paul says you can't do that. He forbids that. If there had happened to be some circumstance where she just determined she had something to say and she was going to say it within the worship assembly, 1 Corinthians 14 says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Even if you had a spiritual gift, even if you had the gift of prophecy, even if you could speak in tongues, Paul says not permitted within the worship assembly. All right, so definitions granted. I'll share some things I've got with you too, but let me go back to Tom first. So he asked the first question. So what was your question again, Tom, so I understand it clearly?
It says if the woman had a question, she would keep
Yeah.
silent. She'd ask her husband at home.
Right.
So she's not married, she doesn't have a husband. Now, the woman that's single, that's a question. She goes to the one that's in authority, the elder, or whoever's in charge of the services.
Yeah. I think sometimes we get a little hung up on that phrase more than we should, because sometimes when we speak with assumptive viewpoint. And what I mean is the vast majority of women who would have been in their assemblies would have had a what? Would have had a husband. Okay? So you use some assumptive language in some ways when you speak in those kind of circles. He's not forbidding a single woman to find the proper moment in time to go ask her question to somebody in authority. He's emphasizing you're going to stop these outbursts where somebody gave a prophecy and you're not so sure that's right, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. No. Ask your husband when you get home. That's the proper way to address that. That's what Paul was saying. They are not to interrupt and to speak out in those formal assemblies of when the church has come together, the text says, for worship, she has to subject herself with some control. And even if she's got something that concerns her, there's a proper place and way to address that. And it's not jumping out amidst the worship assembly.
Well, then whoever's in charge, the elder or something, could permit her to ask the question.
Well, no. I disagree. Not during the assembly. Because somewhere out of the assembly, yes. Because an elder would not have a right to circumvent what God has said. And so even if as an elder, you can
Have this question asked to me.
yeah. No, a single person would have tons of ways to address their question outside of the assembly. Plenty of ways for her to get her questions or issues resolved.
That's the way I always answer the
Yeah.
question. Ask me that question.
And that's really what he's saying. That's what he's saying. Because you can hear him going, well, what if I've got a question? What if there's a problem? What if there's... Well, ask your husband at home. Ask your questions outside of that assembly realm and get them addressed that way. Go ahead, Bob.
1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, I'm not wanting to get into head cover, but solely the aspect of certain commentators say that a woman praying and prophesying in this situation is in the assembly. I don't think it is. I was wondering your opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't know that 1 Corinthians 11 gives us a context of the assembly. And why I say that is that from all indications from the language of the text, when he's addressing different aspects of how spiritual gifts are handled, and when he gets to chapter 14, I'm going to address them. And keep in mind, he didn't write, we wrote chapter 14, verse 1. We wrote that in for Paul. He wrote a letter. But when he gets to that point in the letter, then he starts addressing the assembly as it relates to that. I think 1 Corinthians chapter 11, although it addresses how should they handle their spiritual gifts in the presence of more than potentially just women, but I do not see an assembly context until you get later in the chapter.
Your father and I and several others spent several nights, like once a week, getting together and studying the first part of chapter 11. In no way could we find a way that we could make that the assembly.
Yeah.
So that had to help change my mind about this.
Right.
Because we could not prove that it was an assembly.
Yeah. And by the way, just for food for thought, even those who believe in the covering as a requirement don't view 1 Corinthians 11 as solely an assembly. They generally believe in it as something that needs to be done anytime that there's a spiritual context to the moment. And so whether it's a prayer at a meal, at a family reunion, or whatever, even those who take that position recognize that he's not just addressing the assembly in 1 Corinthians 11. Much more generic. Definitely is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, because he says I
think if you go back to a comment you made earlier, at the core of all of this is respect for God's order of authority.
Yeah.
That's really what both of these passages boil down to is God set up a system of authority. God, Christ, man, woman. And it's the way that God, delivered it. It's the way that God set it up. And out of respect for God's order of authority, these are some of the ways that it can be respected in not causing a disruption, a turmoil, a chaotic, service in the assembly with the, for lack of a better term, the shout outs and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as this part in 1 Timothy 2, it's on that same line, but at the core, Paul is just kind of stating the same thing. You need to have respect for God's order of authority. And that's the way I kind of see it.
And that's when he defined, let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. I suffer not a woman to teach nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. What's the reason for that, Paul? Why this restriction? Why this guidance? Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. He tells us why. The reason why is, number one, Adam was formed first. And without sounding overly callous, and you got to be careful how you say things, but yet I'm not too worried about political correctness, because you worry about that, you never say anything that's true. But he's given order here. Adam was formed first, and whether folks want to cry that's not fair or whatever they want to say about it, it doesn't change what God has said. Adam was formed first, then Eve. God placed man in the authoritative chain. Didn't mean he's smarter, doesn't mean he's better, doesn't mean he's got a better role, doesn't mean that he's more important. It doesn't mean any of those things. It simply means that God has given order to things, authority to things. And He's placed man over woman in that order of things. And then He gives a definition of the fact that Adam was not deceived, but the woman was. Part of the definition of why this order was created. And then he points to a specific role of women, which is childbearing. In other words, I don't know. I think sometimes we get hung up on she shall be saved in childbearing, like he's referencing some sort of spiritual salvation here. I don't know that that's what Paul's driving at. What I believe Paul's driving at here is simply man has a role and women have a role. And Adam was formed first, and he has his role of authority that he needs to live up to. And women have a role and a position that God has placed them in, and they need to live up to the responsibilities that God has given them with all holiness, with sobriety.
Brian, what you have in the garden is a perfect example of what happens when someone tries to move beyond the role they've been given. That's why he makes that statement. Eve was actually in the transgression because of violating the law of God, but also because she took it upon herself to make this decision rather than rather than kind of just as God said, of kind of submitting to the authority of her husband. And Adam failed as the head of the family to set the lead and say, no, this is sinning against God, we're not doing this. And so when you have this reversal of roles, you see the chaos that comes about. And so, like you said, what God is saying is, both of you will fulfill your responsibilities to God if you stay in the roles that He has set.
And both honor God in holiness and sobriety by accepting the role. And here's the hard part. And sometimes I think people wonder, well, how can we convince the world of these things? I don't know that we can. And the reason is, if somebody doesn't accept God as the Creator, then how can I convince them that He's created male and female for exactly the purpose that He had ordained and purposed for them? It's hard to convince. You can't. Sometimes we get the car. You almost have to take a step back and talk about God as Creator and get that ingrained in their minds before you can ever have a conversation about the roles that God has given to men and women and the responsibilities that each have. And that's somewhat of a different conversation altogether.
We don't have spiritual gifts today and prophecies and stuff. I don't understand. How does it affect us today? Are we still...
Okay, so here's how it affects us today. 1 Corinthians 14 affects us in this fashion. That there's a restriction during the assembly, the worship assembly of the church, where to maintain decency and order, she should remain silent. Now, obviously, there are other things that she's told to do. Everybody's told to sing. You know, the silence restriction here relates to the formal aspects of the worship and who's governing over those formal aspects. Who's going to be given the prophecies today and who's going to speak in tongues. Well, you're going to find a few of them to do it, and we're going to have women stay silent during that period of time. And then 1 Timothy 2 applies in a more general sense of how it is that she can conduct herself in a respectful manner to the authority that God has given men and the responsibilities of that.
How do these churches who have women in authority decide with this? How can they explain it?
Well, you're asking me to answer on their behalf, and I don't know that I can. But I can tell you generically what happens is one of a couple of things. Some will just simply say Paul was an unmarried male chauvinist and he didn't like women. So we can ignore everything he says about women. I've read and seen people say that. Just ignore what Paul has to say about women because unmarried guy and kind of just puts it on him. Others will argue that the church evolves over time. And that as the church evolves and time evolves, we don't prescribe to the same kinds of restrictions that the early church may have. Yeah, right. And so whatever they use is still going to have to argue against the very principles that are here in the text in the various ways they might do that.
But just like with any other teaching, the third thing they do is having come from that kind of background is taking scriptures and twisting it into something that it didn't mean. Using Old Testament scriptures, using other scriptures, and trying to kind of twist it into what God never intended.
Well, and not only that, but Jim, there's a general lack of desire to worry about authority when it comes to spiritual matters anyway. Among many religious individuals, there's a general disregard for authority and even a conversation of authority. So they're not concerned about whether they can go to a Bible verse and validate what they're doing. And then of course they'll use the emotional factors where they'll talk about how it's unfair and how dare you say that I can't be this or do that. And again, the arguments with these texts, not necessarily with the message.
They know more than God does.
Sometimes.
Okay, it might be an insignificant point, but I don't think it is. I have the King James Version. Now, when that is published, the publisher makes comments about different points, different subjects, like in 1 Timothy 2. Right at the beginning it says prayer and public worship. You drop down to the next one, and before verse 9 it says women in public worship. And we do that, and we don't, it's already studied for me.
Yeah.
See, and that happens in many cases.
Sure.
Go back to like 24th chapter of Matthew.
Yeah.
And you're going to see the same thing. And we have to be careful that we do our studying of the context, not what they put in.
Right. And not base our conclusions on assumptions and generally thought of ideas. They may be right, but there needs to be a reason why they're right, not just because they said so.
Cases that throughout the New Testament especially, that they are wrong in several of them.
Okay. Let me get to the practical reason why this subject came up, though, before I run out of time tonight, and because I'm hoping not to do this again Sunday. I hope to move on Sunday. So really, I think in general, most people that at least assembled here tonight, particularly the ladies that pinned this question, they pretty much get that from the assembly, the worship assembly standpoint. I rarely hear much argument about whether they should be leading singing or leading in prayers or preaching the sermons. That's not what we're doing right now. Is really where the question usually comes up. What about Bible class? Can women teach in Bible class formats? In our children's classes downstairs, can they speak when we're gathered together in this moment here in our Bible class time? Do these principles that seem to be very clearly applicable to the public assembly worship time, do they apply to this moment in time in our Bible class studies? And I think that's really where most challenges, if you will, or questions come up as it relates to that. And so let me just share some things with you, and then if you have feedback or other questions relating to it, I'll be glad to talk about that. Number one, I'm going to remind you that in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 12, the context of thought is a woman to teach, didactos, which is formal, in a position of authority, because that would require her to usurp authority over the whom? The man. And so let's tackle real quick question number one. What defines a man? Great question, right? And the question is then, are children who may obey the gospel young, but are they men? So if a woman went downstairs to teach a Bible class, and there's a young boy sitting there who happens to have obeyed the gospel at some point in life, is she usurping him by teaching that Bible class? And let me preface all of these things I'm about to say, by the way, with if her conscience challenges, if it bothers her that there's a young man or young boy sitting there who has obeyed the gospel, if her conscience bothers her that she shouldn't teach that class, she shouldn't teach that class. So hear me clearly on that. I would never want to even, and I don't even try to argue with, to truthfully known, I don't even debate that. If that's where their conscience is, if in time on their own they kind of think differently about that, then so be it. I don't try to talk people out of their consciences. I don't know that that's an exercise that's of value, to try to convince somebody out of something that's a matter of conscience, especially when it comes to matters of expediencies rather than the law of God. But if you're asking me, I think there is a difference between a young boy and a man. That young boy still answers to the authority of whom? His parents, including his mother, right? That same boy sitting in that Bible class is going to go home and have to answer to the authority of his mother. And my point is, it's kind of hard to usurp and say, well, you're usurping authority in one setting, but his mother, who's a woman, would not be usurping him when she tells him, go clean your room. The point is this is about a man. This isn't about young boys who happen to have been baptized at some point. This is about men. The word is man. And to define manhood by the moment that somebody is baptized, I don't know that I can do that. I don't know that I can define manhood as happening in the instant that young person is baptized into Christ. The issue at hand is the order God has established. And He said she cannot teach nor to usurp authority over the man. And so I do not believe she's restricted when we're talking about young boys who happen to have obeyed the gospel. If her conscience says so, then she should walk away. But I see a stark difference between a boy and a man. Otherwise, I'm convinced, because again, I don't see 1 Timothy 2 as solely about the assembly. Then his own mother can't speak to him in an authoritative way, if that be the case.
A man who's going to teach a Bible class should be one who is able to digest, and impart the meat of the Word. I mean, he's moved from the milk of the Word. He's progressed to have a good working knowledge of the Bible, and that defines, in my mind, a man.
Right. If you wanted to define a spiritual manhood, it would be the definition that God has provided in relationship to His ability to digest greater and more meatier matters of the law and the testimony of Scripture. And a young newborn babe in Christ who's not necessarily very old has not reached that spiritual maturity yet either.
When you stand up before an audience such as this and you begin to teach, you know they're going to want some answers.
Right.
And you better have a good working knowledge.
Right.
I guess it's I agree that it's a matter of conscience. I guess if I were to consider the other side of that, what about a 50-year-old individual who comes to a knowledge of Christ and is immersed in water, and he's a 50-year-old male, but he's a babe in Christ.
Yeah.
He's just, and what about the young boy that we're talking about, maybe 11, 12 years old, who's not a man at some point, but in the assembly has the authority to present a lesson on a training class night. I'm just kind of.
Well, I'll take what you're saying. I believe Randy's right in the application he's making. That's not the sole thing you look at.
Right.
It is one piece that you would look at. How can I determine what's man? Well, we can look at his spiritual development and decide that. You've got to look at chronology. I mean, you have to look at chronology as well, and appreciate it from that standpoint as well, and be cautious in that regard. My issue has always been in relationship to this subject. If it's either he is under the authority of no woman or any woman, if you understand what I'm saying, and that's where I get hung up. You can't. I don't think we can pick and choose and say, well, in this environment he's not allowed to be, but in this environment he is allowed. I think we've got to figure out, is this young person a man yet or not, and use whatever's fair, and that's going to vary. It will vary, but depending on the individual and the circumstances surrounding that individual. There are a lot of factors. And I think reasonable people can make a conclusion about whether what we're dealing with here.
Get back to the case study that you brought up, the fact that a woman teaching a child in Bible study who just recently become a member. We're talking about a babe in Christ, and he's still also chronologically a babe. At this point in time, the Jews used the age of 20 before they was accounted as a male for battle. They wasn't even counted in
The number of men.
Israel.
Yeah, and
So this is close to that time frame.
yeah, and so it helps. All of these things kind of help frame for us. How do we define when and if she has usurped or taught over a man in some kind of formal capacity?
You got to take everything in context and study that. Render it or verdict on it.
So let me take this one step further, though, because I think there's a greater question maybe here at hand. Those are kind of, side issues that come up once in a while. Why do we have Bible classes to begin with? Where's the "Thus saith the Lord" on Bible classes? Okay, right. But is it the same as upon the first day of the week the disciples came forth to break bread? No. Right? It's different. Yeah, it's an expediency to fulfill a purpose that God has given the church. But it is not the same as coming together for the formal worship of God, because that worship is governed by all kinds of guidance and instruction, right? When it comes to taking the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, when it comes to how it is that we sing, when it comes to the prayers that are offered, when it comes to who's permitted to fulfill those assembly roles, all of those are worship assemblies. The Bible class is an expediency to fulfill the purpose of a congregation to educate anyone and everyone who desires to learn about God's Word. The question comes up sometimes, is there a distinction between the assembly when we've come together for worship and the Bible classes? And I've heard that answered a couple of different ways. One way I've heard people say is, well, we break up into Bible classes. And because we've broken up into Bible classes, it is not the whole church that has come together. Well, I'm not so sure that's the best way to address that. I don't know whether that holds enough weight as an authoritative thought, to me anyway, to say, well, we're not really the whole church because we broke up in Bible classes, so the same rules of 1 Corinthians 14 don't apply because we broke. I don't know that's the way I would approach that. The way I believe is maybe a better way to examine that is that this is a separate purpose from worship. We come together to worship. We come together to study. They're two distinct things. Let me illustrate this way. Because here's something that confuses folks. On the first day of the week, we've gathered around this table for over 100 years in almost this very building, right? It's wrapped around it anyway. And I could almost tell you that just about every single time, because of the way we do it, as soon as that Lord's Supper is done, what's the guy standing there saying? And now, what's his next phrase? We've concluded the Lord's Supper, and separate and apart from the Lord's Supper, we're going to pass these around, right? And what's he doing? He's trying to help us appreciate, though the moment is bunched together, though the moment is simultaneous in some senses, we just got done with the Lord's Supper, to help anybody recognize that what we're about to do is a completely distinct purpose. We say, separate and apart from the Lord's Supper, we're now about to take a collection. It's to help us frame our minds that what just happened and what is about to happen are two different things. Here's my point. I use that to illustrate it. I'm convinced that the worship assembly and our Bible studies are two distinct purposes. They are two completely different, distinct purposes that the church has every right to fulfill, has every right to engage, but because the Bible study, not because we happen to break apart into and we're not really all together. I just don't think that weighs enough. Because we've come together for two different purposes. In one moment, we've come together for Bible study. In another moment, we've come together to worship. And those moments may happen to be connected to each other in a reasonable amount of time. Let me give you what I believe to be case in point. In about 5 minutes, I wish it was 25, but in about 5, we're going to stop our Bible study and we're going to enter into a period of worship. And they are distinct. During the Bible study, because these rules of 1 Corinthians 14 don't have the same application outside of the worship assembly. That's why I'm comfortable with women asking questions in Bible class. It's why I'm comfortable with women speaking. Because this and the worship are two different things. Two completely distinct actions. Both governed, both given responsibilities-wise to the congregation and the church to fulfill. But I think what happens is and here may be where the problem is, and I'm not trying to insult anybody, I want you to think about it. We have gotten in our minds that anytime we step inside this building, it's automatically a worship service. Except it happens to be a wedding. Or except it happens to be a funeral. Or except it happens to be a Bible study. Everything that happens inside the building isn't a worship service. Everything the church is allowed to do inside the building isn't a worship service. The church has right to use every resource it has to do any God-given purpose. Any God-given purpose, right? If God has given the church a God-given purpose, then it can use whatever resource it has to its availability to fulfill that purpose. And if it means giving folks an opportunity to sit down, open their Bibles, and discuss God's Word, turn the lights on, unlock the doors, let's strengthen the brethren in Bible study. We sometimes get our minds too focused on the idea that if it happens here, it's worship. If it happens in my house, then it does. It's not. They're different. No, not necessarily. Just because it happens in this building doesn't always make it a worship. And therefore, the same guidelines and restrictions don't always apply. If it happened to be just because the saints had gathered together, guess what? You better be quiet all the way to the parking lot. Right? And so we got to use some reasoning skills here to determine what's the purpose and what rules govern that purpose. And everything the church does isn't always about the collective. That's a sermon and a study maybe for a completely another time, but maybe worth some examination at some point. Not everything the church does is about the collective. And what I mean by that is some things the church does affects the individual on an individual basis, not just the whole. What the church has an obligation towards benevolence, right? Benevolence to who? Needy individual saints. The church can fulfill work and roles and purposes God has given it that may not always affect everybody. It may affect a smaller portion. It may affect a single individual. But if it's a God-given work, and it's an expediency to fulfill a God-given purpose, to be the pillar and ground of the truth, to study to show ourselves approved, whatever the purpose is given, then the church has right to use its resources and the things available to it to accomplish that. Why I'm comfortable with women speaking in our Bible classes is because the Bible class and the worship are two different events governed by the role that God has given the Lord's church. And that's why I'm comfortable. Now, if there's ladies whose conscience still tell them I shouldn't speak, then don't. Just because I'm comfortable with it, it's easy for me to be comfortable with it, right? Because I don't have to worry about it. Right? At the end of the day, I don't have to worry. I'm just trying to give you the best knowledge I can as it relates to why I believe that the Bible study is not governed by the same 1 Corinthians 14 principle. I'm sorry if I see hands and stuff. You're just going. I get the authority. It's my class. So don't usurp. Male or female. Sorry, but I got to get it because I got to say these things. The other part that we need to respect about this is that 1 Corinthians 14 does address the assembly. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 address the woman's demeanor at any point in relationship to an authoritative figure. So even in a Bible class, though she may be allowed to speak, she may not have to be silent. She cannot usurp the authority of the teacher. She cannot dominate that classroom. She cannot act in ways that would put her in a position of being didactos, where she's become the formal instructor of the room from the pew. And I saw one time the most interesting thing I'd ever witnessed, where there was a lady wearing a covering who dominated a Bible class, had the symbol of authority, but didn't honor it. And I thought that was very odd to me, that somebody would wear the symbol of authority, but reject the principles of it across the board, because she took on the teacher like there was nobody's business. I learned later it was the preacher's wife. I would not have wanted to be in that car going home that night. And I apologize. I realize I dominated, but I wanted to make sure I said those things as it relates to this. And that's the best knowledge I can impart to you as it addresses these questions and issues. So on your way out, grab the lesson sheets that we'll start on Sunday. A new study, much more practical, easier to understand. We'll look at the life of David. Why was he a man after God's own heart? And talk about how we can become servants of God after God's own heart. And so much more practical lessons coming up in that sense, in that regard, as we move forward. So you can grab those. They're on the table out there. You can grab them on the way out.